Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
They took my brother on an expensive getaway and left me out completely, and I found out the way most humiliating betrayals arrive these days, through social media photos that popped up on my feed while I was sitting in my small apartment, eating reheated pasta and trying not to notice how quiet everything felt. There he was, my brother Michael, smiling with the kind of confidence only someone who's never been denied anything could wear, his arm around my mother, while my dad held up a margarita as if he'd won some prize for fatherhood. The caption read, "Family time we all deserved," and that line was what burned the most, because for as long as I can remember, family had been a word that meant Michael and whoever happens to orbit him at the moment. While I was treated like the extra baggage they tolerated because I came with the package. Growing up with Michael meant learning very early that in our house there was no such thing as balance, no such thing as even ground. He was the golden child, the one teachers praised, the one coaches begged to keep, the one my parents saw as a bright future they could mold, while I was constantly made to feel like the trial run that hadn't turned out quite right. I remember sitting through his endless baseball games where my parents clapped until their hands turned red, then listening to them dismiss the small awards I brought home from debate tournaments as nice, but not really useful. I wasn't the problem child, but I also wasn't the shining star, and in our family, being overlooked was almost worse than being scolded, because at least scolding meant someone noticed you existed. When we were teenagers, the difference only grew sharper. Michael got a car the day he turned 16, a used but polished SUV with a giant bow on top, while I was handed a lecture about responsibility and told I could borrow Mom's old sedan if I really needed to get to work. He got trips to ski resorts. I got the privilege of babysitting the neighbors' kids while they were away. He got excuses when he screwed up. Boys will be boys, he'll learn, while I got silence when I did well. Even then I told myself it was fine, that once I got older I'd build my own life, but the truth is you never really shake off the sting of being the afterthought, especially when it comes from the people who are supposed to see you first. So when I heard about the Cancun trip, the one they apparently planned for weeks without mentioning a word to me, something inside me finally cracked. My mother had called a few days before they left, making small talk about work and asking if I was keeping busy, and not once did she slip in that she, Dad, and Michael were about to spend a week in an all-inclusive resort by the beach. They didn't tell me until the night before, when Michael casually mentioned it on the phone, as if he was talking about running to the grocery store. "Yeah, Mom and Dad and I are heading out tomorrow. Should be fun. You know how stressed Dad's been. Anyway, wish us luck." I remember holding the phone, forcing myself to laugh lightly and say, "Of course, have fun," while my chest felt like it was caving in. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the wall, thinking about how many times I'd tried to convince myself that their favoritism didn't matter, that I could carve out my own place in the world and not need their approval. But seeing them post pictures, calling it family time, was a different kind of wound. It was like they were declaring, publicly, that I wasn't even part of the family unit anymore. They didn't just forget me, they erased me. And while part of me wanted to scream, another part of me went very still, the way you do when you realize the fight isn't worth it anymore, not because you lost, but because you're finally ready to change the rules. I thought back to all the little signals over the years, my father telling me during Thanksgiving that we'll always support Michael, he's the future of this family, or my mother brushing off my frustration by saying, "Don't be jealous. Your brother just needs more help right now." Those words had felt like stabs at the time, but now they were fuel, because I realized they weren't wrong about one thing: Michael was their future. Which meant they never saw me coming. By dawn I had already made up my mind. I looked around my apartment, at the secondhand furniture and the piles of unpaid bills I had been balancing on my own, and I thought about what I was going to leave behind, and more importantly, what I was going to take. I didn't cry, because crying felt like admitting I still cared about their approval, and I was done with that game. Instead, I started to plan, carefully and quietly, not for a confrontation, but for an exit. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because while they were packing swimsuits and sunscreen, imagining a carefree week where their golden child would bask in their attention, I was building something else. An escape that would not only free me from their orbit, but also make sure they finally noticed the hole I left behind. So I smiled when Michael said goodbye on the phone, I nodded when my mother texted me, "See you soon," and I played along as if nothing was wrong. But in my head, I was already gone. And that night, as their plane lifted off the ground, I whispered to myself, this is it. This is the last time I will ever wait to be chosen. Because I wasn't going to wait anymore. I was going to choose myself, and when they came back, they were going to find out just how much I had taken with me. I woke before sunrise on the day they left, the way you do when your head has already made a decision and your body just scrambles to catch up, and I moved around my small apartment with the odd calm of someone breaking up with a life that never really loved her back. Opening drawers, making quiet stacks, sorting the things that were mine and the things that were only here because I had been too tired to carry them away sooner, and, while the coffee machine hissed, I pulled out the bulging manila folder labeled family, the one nobody knew I kept, because when your parents pretend you are an afterthought, they also forget you are the one who fixed the printer, balanced the emergency payments, created the document templates, and kept the passwords in a brain they never bothered to respect. I packed deliberately rather than dramatically, folding clothes that still smelled of the laundromat and sliding in the small heirlooms that had been temporarily parked with me for years. The silver locket from Grandma Ruth that my mother said she would deal with after the holidays, the watch my father once promised to have resized for me and then forgot in a kitchen drawer, the Polaroids nobody digitized even though I said I would, which I actually did while everyone else debated photo frames. I took what was mine by memory if not by paperwork, and I took the evidence that I had held this family together in ways that never made it onto social media, which meant the backup drives I had labeled with clear dates. The spreadsheet of recurring bills my mother had texted me about each month, the scanned tax folders from the year my dad's back went out, and I filed the extension while they were at Michael's playoff game. Before I closed the last suitcase, I opened my laptop and did 3 simple things I should have done a year ago. I turned off every autopay that ran through my card because apparently being the dependable one meant quietly sponsoring streaming services I didn't watch and a security system I didn't arm. I changed my email recovery on the accounts I had created for them after they locked themselves out for the 10th time, and I scheduled a crisp, professional message to the small vendors tied to my father's side gig bookkeeping, which I had performed for free out of duty and stupidity, informing them the point of contact would change on Monday and that any unpaid invoices for data cleanup would be attached. Nothing cruel. Just market rate for work already done. The kind of boundary you only learn to set after you realize that being the reliable one is a trap disguised as love. I drove across town to their house because of course I had a key. The same worn brass key I was given in high school for emergencies, which somehow always turned out to be printer jams, Wi-Fi resets, or dropping off the dog at the groomer when Michael had a thing. And as the garage door hummed and the car cooled, I let myself into the hollow quiet every home has when a family is away, that faint echo of a place that assumes it will be reoccupied. I didn't snoop. I didn't stage some dramatic scene. I moved through the rooms like a responsible ghost, collecting the box of my childhood awards from the basement that my mother had once suggested we donate because they were dust catchers, sliding the 3 framed photos where I existed. Graduation, a hiking trip, a blurry birthday, into a cloth bag because I was done leaving my face on walls that mostly reflected back Michael's grin, and then I opened the desk drawer where the safe deposit keys lived and took the one Grandma Ruth had told me, very pointedly, was for me someday when people were done being sentimental and ready to be fair. On the kitchen counter, I left their house key on a square of paper because symbolism helps people understand plain facts, and on that paper I wrote a single sentence that could not be misread: I am not your emergency contact anymore, which felt less like a goodbye and more like finally canceling a subscription that kept auto-renewing no matter how many times I hit the button. Then, because chaos is not my style, I fed the goldfish, topped off the plants, wiped down the counter, and took the modem box from the hall closet that was inexplicably in my name, of course it was, and dropped it at the provider on my way out, because I was not going to keep paying for their Wi-Fi while they called me ungrateful behind my back. I rented a small storage unit with a month-to-month plan. slid the boxes inside like I was tucking in stubborn feelings, and filed the notarized form that removed me as cosigner on the old family truck my father had moved into my name for insurance reasons, which the bank assured me would trigger a quiet review and an updated policy by midweek. Nothing dramatic, just paperwork nudged into honesty. Afterward, I sat in my car and listened to my mother's first voicemail arrive, the bright song voice she uses when she wants to sound warm without saying anything real, telling me that they had just landed and the place was so stunning, and that Michael had already found the gym, and wasn't that just like him, and I let it play to the end. Then scrolled through the photos she had blasted to our group thread, the one they mostly used to coordinate around his schedule, and I felt something close to relief, like a muscle unclenching after years of bracing for a blow that never came. Because indifference did the job instead. On my way to the new apartment I had signed for under a short lease with a plain view of a parking lot, I stopped at the post office and mailed 3 certified envelopes that contained inventories a reasonable person could respect. One list of the items that were mine and why, one list of logins now transferred back to their owners with notes on how to reset without me, and one list of unpaid hours I would no longer donate. It was not a ransom demand and not a plea, it was a ledger. The kind grown women make when they finally admit the math of a family has never once added up in their favor, and I understood they would hate it because the only thing more offensive than a boundary is proof that it should have existed all along. By the time twilight blurred the edges of the day, my suitcases were stacked against a new wall that did not know my name, and the scheduled messages were set to go out one after another like a metronome, steady and unemotional. While I lay on a mattress that still smelled like plastic and stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet thump of someone else's life through the vent, and in the middle of that plainness I laughed, not mean but a little wild, because I realized the thing I had taken that would sting most was not the locket, not the passwords, not even the discounts tied to my email. It was the unpaid labor that kept their days frictionless, the invisible grease I had poured onto the stuck gears of their lives for years. And as my phone lit up with another call I did not answer and a new photo of Michael at dinner with a caption about family blessings, I set one last timer. A small automation nested inside an automation that would introduce a silence into their week at precisely the wrong moment. Not cruel, just corrective, and I closed my eyes with the kind of peace that doesn't ask permission, knowing that when their plane brought them home, the first thing they would notice would not be the missing objects, but the sudden gravity where ease used to be, and that what I left behind would ring louder than anything I packed. The first voicemail from my mother was bright and chirpy, the way she sounds when she thinks sugar will dissolve concrete, and she launched straight into a cheerful report about their flight home and how the resort had restored our spirits, as if sunlight and cocktails could convert a blind spot into a virtue. And while she rambled in that soft, focused tone, I opened my email to watch the scheduled messages fire like quiet flares across a dark field, invoices sliding into inboxes, password resets reverting to their rightful owners, and the final notice to the bookkeeping clients politely stating that the complimentary services provided by Miles had concluded, which sounded almost luxurious until you remembered complimentary meant free because a daughter was too loyal to say no. By the time their plane touched down, the first consequences began to hum, small at first, like the sound a refrigerator makes before it dies, and then sharper as the autopays I had canceled finished their last cycles, and the apps they relied on demanded fresh logins they no longer possessed, which meant my father's streaming accounts blinked out in the middle of the evening news he liked to scold. The security app timed out and asked a code only I knew, and the family cloud that had held years of photos prompted an authentication that no longer pointed to my email, because in my private ledger of fairness I had moved everything back to original owners or to nobody at all, letting dormant accounts become exactly what they were without me, forgetful. Michael texted first with the lazy confidence of a man who has never had a gate close on him, asking if I had changed something by accident, because his gym fob wasn't syncing with the app and the payment on file had weirdly lapsed, which made me smile despite myself, because even in the small things he assumed the world existed to be seamless for him, and I wrote back a single sentence that sounded professional enough to pass for neutral, You will need to update your own details with your own card, which, as replies go, was gentler than the monologue I could have delivered about adulthood being more than muscles and a confident laugh. Next came my father, not with anger, but with that stubborn dignity he wears like an old suit, informing me that the internet seems to be misconfigured, and would I pop by to fix it. An invitation so thoroughly soaked in assumption that I read it twice to admire the craftsmanship, and instead of answering, I forwarded his message to the provider with a request to finalize the account transition we had begun when I dropped off the modem, attaching the signed form that removed my liability, which meant that by dinner time a perfectly polite representative would explain to him that the plan now lived under his name and that any reactivation required a card that did not end in the digits he only remembered because they were mine. But my mother was the one who caught on. She called, and when I did not pick up, she texted, not emojis or exclamation points, just a clipped line that read, "What did you do?" without a question mark, which is precisely how she used to ask, "What did you say to your aunt?" Whenever I said something true at a family gathering that made people uncomfortable, and I set the phone down because I finally understood the shape of the lesson I wanted to teach, a lesson not about cruelty or chaos, but about gravity. The kind you only feel after years of floating above someone who is quietly holding the rope. That night they pulled into the driveway to a house that felt familiar but not obedient, lights on a timer still doing their little show, plants watered, goldfish alive, mail stacked by date, because I am not a monster, yet the pathways they walked without looking, logins, bills, silent renewals, automatic transfers, had grown visible like wires after a ceiling is opened, and each tug required a call they were not used to making, to an institution that now asked for answers I had always supplied. And if there is any justice in the small theater of family life, it is the sight of people realizing convenience is not a birthright, but a service someone has been providing for free. My revenge, if we insist on that word, was not the box of jewelry or the watch, or even the key to the safe deposit drawer with my name folded into Grandma Ruth's stationery. It was the letter I had mailed to their homeowners association under my father's signature template, a tidy, polite, absolutely airtight notice that the emergency contact on file had been updated to the only person who had ever treated me like I mattered, myself, at a new number they did not possess, and that in the event of a home security alert, the association should call the primary resident and then the police, not Rachel, who lives nearby and can pop over, which meant that when the test alert I had scheduled, a harmless maintenance ping the provider sends if you check the right box, rang through late the next afternoon. The call went exactly where it should have gone for years, to my parents, who learned in real time that I was not their on-call technician, their night watch, or their free labor on holidays. I would love to tell you that was the moment they apologized, that a dam broke and decades of small erasures flooded into confession, but family rarely gives you cinematic catharsis. It gives you silence you can measure in inches. And I will admit that as I listened to the voicemails stack, first annoyed, then baffled, finally quiet, I felt not triumph but a steadiness I had envied in other people since college, the kind that makes you say, with a voice no longer pleading, "This is the cost of pretending one person's needs are the entire family." For the first time in my life, I did not pick up and I did not rush in, and when Michael finally wrote, "Okay, this is getting ridiculous, Mom is freaking out," I sent him the most useful thing I could give a grown man who has never had to assemble anything on his own, a list of every number he would need to restore his comforts, from the bank to the cloud service to the HIA office, each line ending with a sentence that should have been obvious years ago, "You can do this yourself," and while that message traveled, I packed a small overnight bag, locked the door of my new apartment, and stepped into a cab with a destination I would not text to anyone, because my next move belonged only to me. And because the thing they still did not understand was that I had taken more than objects and access. I had taken the power to decide where I would be when the last card slipped, and what, exactly, I would make them feel when it did. They returned to a house that still smelled like lemon cleaner and watered soil and heat settling into drywall, the kind of domestic order I always kept without narration, and for a few strange minutes I pictured them walking room to room and pronouncing everything fine. Because superficial fine is our family's specialty, until the moment my mother tried to cast the photos from her phone onto the big living room screen and the TV asked for a login that didn't exist anymore, and my father reached for the remote with the same reflexive confidence he has used for decades, only to discover that confidence does not enter passwords, and Michael, who lives by swagger and membership access, held up his watch to pay for a grocery delivery and blinked in real confusion when the screen refused him and the app suggested that perhaps the default card holder would like to confirm his purchase, which is how the first hairline cracks of panic began to spread through their very curated afternoon. I did not take joy in the scramble, at least not the childish kind that runs around the room high-fiving itself, because the part of me that has always handled emergencies kept trying to stand up out of habit, rehearsing the call order and the fixes I could do while stirring a pot, and I had to talk that reflex into lying down, reminding it that the lack of a password was not a fire, the lack of a free bookkeeper was not a hospital visit, and that grown people with resources could contact customer support like everyone else, even if the wait music offended their sense of importance. So I made tea in my new kitchen and let the phone vibrate on the counter while I watched the steam lift off the mug and collide with the soft whir of a refrigerator that does not know my parents' names. And with every voicemail that landed, I heard their tone shift in careful stages, from breezy annoyance to firm instruction to that bewildered quiet you only hear when people meet the work they have never valued and realize it is not automatic, it is not atmospheric, it has always been the labor of an unthanked person in the next room. They tried the neighbors, of course, because reputation is our family's currency, and when Mrs. Turner could not miraculously make the home Wi-Fi reappear, my father, who has given decades to perfecting the voice men used to command compliance without raising volume, called me and left a message that started with my name and ended with a long breath. A sound I do not remember hearing from him since the year I broke my wrist, and he drove like the car was made of porcelain, which almost softened me until he added, "It would be helpful if you could pop by," as if helpful were a love language and popping by were a hobby I had been neglecting. Instead, I sent the simplest reply a human can send without crossing into hostility, a text that read, "You have everything you need to handle this," and then I put the phone face down and folded laundry with the slow, deliberate movements of someone measuring out a new strength in inches rather than grand declarations. By late afternoon, the scheduled envelopes I had mailed reached their targets, and the proper nouns of our life, bank, HOA, provider, storage facility, began performing the mundane theater of updated records and verified identities, which sounds unromantic until you are the one bribing your sanity back from the altar of just this one favor, and in that administrative choreography sat the second act of my revenge, because I am not interested in smashing anything. I am interested in teaching people to carry their own weight, so I submitted the request to remove my number as the primary contact for their home security. I finalized the closure on the family phone plan that has lived on my credit profile since college and that I have repeatedly been told is easier for everyone, when what they meant was free for everyone. And I set the termination to coincide with the end of the billing cycle because I am not gratuitously cruel, only precise, leaving them several days to transfer their numbers and endure the instructive discomfort of an afternoon without service if they did not. Dinner time brought the third stage, the one I built not for spectacle but for clarity, when a courier set a banker's box on their porch with my mother's handwriting on the label, reproduced from old to-do lists, because detail matters. And inside that box I placed every piece of physical proof that I had been the quiet infrastructure of their lives, neatly tabbed folders of recurring bills with notes in the margins that explained where to call and what to say, a binder with screenshots of the cloud family sharing settings annotated like a teacher's lesson plan, the 3 framed photos of me wrapped in brown paper with a stick-on label that read, in a handwriting my mother would recognize from science fair boards and Christmas tags, "These are not decorations. They are acknowledgments," and underneath the stack, like a calm spine, an itemized invoice marked paid in full that covered the unpaid hours I had already recouped through reimbursements, a figure that would not ruin them yet. Would sting because it quantified something they have preferred to see as a daughter's personality rather than work with market value. I allowed myself a laugh when Michael texted me a photo of the box with the caption, "Is this a joke?" because it confirmed a truth I have been circling since childhood, which is that some people only understand love when it arrives as service. And when service stops, they call it a prank rather than a change in the weather, and I almost replied with a joke about muscle memory and logins, but chose silence instead, since silence is the new language I am learning, a language that says, without apology, that my time is an asset I now choose how to spend. The revenge at the end of that day was small and perfectly shaped, a final piece I had timed for the hour my mother likes to sit with her tea and scroll, a single, spare post on my page with comments turned off that read, "I am safe. I am unavailable for unpaid support. Please contact my parents directly for matters concerning their home," and Michael, which was not a drag, not a public lashing, but a redirect that pushed the attention where it has always belonged, back to the people who benefited, and within minutes the private messages began to arrive from cousins and old friends, not gossiping but asking if I was okay, and for the first time I felt the ground tilt toward me. The narrative thread slipping out of my family's hands and into a neutral place where facts could sit without perfume. As dusk stormed the edges of their quiet street and the box waited on the porch like a mirror nobody wanted to look into, another envelope I had scheduled through the courier service made its way to their mailbox, slim and heavy. Addressed in that same careful handwriting and marked to be opened after dinner, an envelope that held a single object wrapped in tissue and a note with an address and a code, and while my mother stood by the sink and ran her finger under the flap, I stepped out of my new building and into the night with keys in my pocket that they had never seen, smiling at the certainty that when they unfolded what was inside, they would know exactly where I had drawn the line and exactly where they would have to come if they wanted to argue with it. Because tomorrow morning they would decide whether to drive to that address and enter that unit, and whatever they found there would end any debate about what, precisely, I had taken. They came to the address I had written in the envelope with that careful, slightly slanted handwriting my mother used to praise on report cards and then ignore in real life. And they came early because our family believes problems behave if you show up before the building opens, which is how I knew they would be standing in a strip of morning shade outside the storage facility when the metal roll-up doors rattled awake and the manager in a polo shirt nodded them through, and I pictured the three of them walking down that long fluorescent corridor past rows of identical locks, my father carrying the envelope like a warrant, my mother clutching her tote in the way she does when she wants to look composed, but is ready to gather what spills. And Michael slightly ahead, keys jingling, certain all of this would end with something he could lift. Inside the unit they found it exactly as I intended, not empty, not full, just arranged like a small, stubborn museum of obligations and proof. A folding table with 2 chairs and a banker's lamp plugged into the strip outlet I had labeled with a piece of tape that read, "Your turn." A neat stack of binders identical to the one in the porch box, but this time indexed to the year and the month of every invisible rescue I had performed, from the tax extension to the medical claim my mother had once insisted would sort itself out, and then forgot for 7 months, to the refinance calculator my father used to argue with me about rates before he bought Michael another summer of training. And next to those binders a clear plastic bin filled with cords and adapters tagged with names, the sort of graveyard every household accumulates and pretends is neutral. Except these were all purchased by me and then absorbed into the background hum of their comfort, and in the corner on a metal shelf the 3 framed photos of me that I had wrapped in paper and returned the day before now sat unwrapped, facing inward, because sometimes the only way to make a point is to refuse to perform it. On the table I left 2 objects that were not mine yet had become my responsibility through the simple physics of being the person who always remembers where things live. The safe deposit key on Grandma Ruth's braided ribbon and the locket she had promised me with that dry little smile she used when she knew the room would disagree, and beside them a slim black phone with no case and a single contact in it labeled emergencies, which when pressed would ring an automated recording I had made at the public library sound booth, because drama is wasteful and clarity is kind, and in that calm, steady voice I explained what they were looking at with the same patience I used to use when I guided them through forms, telling them that the unit contained a complete transfer of duties back to the rightful owners, that the key should be placed in my mother's purse because it had been hers to manage since Grandma died, that the locket was already insured under their policy until they updated it, and that the binders were theirs to keep or shred depending on whether they wanted a history of the work they never saw in front of them. And then I said the part they would circle for weeks, that I had taken only what I had earned and what had been allocated to me in writing, that the rest of the value they imagined I had stolen was the cost of no longer being allowed to plug into me. Some people would call this petty, some would call it theatrical. And I admit there was a part of me that enjoyed the symmetry of watching them walk into a space curated by the daughter they underestimated and being forced to read labels like visitors at an exhibit where the art fights back. But the backbone of this last move was not spectacle, it was accounting, because I also left a sealed manila envelope addressed to my father containing a breakdown of the classifications he respects even when he does not like them: services rendered, reimbursement for direct charges, asset distribution per Grandma's instruction, and a notation about the years of incidental costs I was choosing to forgive because I refused to spend another season itemizing what love disguised as convenience had required of me. And on the final page a signature line where he could initial to acknowledge receipt, because closure without ink tends to evaporate when people feel embarrassed. I did not hide a key to my new place in that unit, and I did not leave a letter begging to be understood, because a person who finally recognizes her own worth does not bribe anyone into recognizing it too. And yet I left one indulgence, because I am human and sometimes an elegant flourish teaches better than another spreadsheet, taped to the inside of the unit door, where they would only see it as they left, was a printed photo from my phone of the three of them at the resort bar holding up those bright drinks, except I had cropped the image until the only human detail left was a sliver of my mother's bracelet and the condensation ring under my father's glass. And across the white space I had typed a sentence that I knew would sound unforgivable until they sat with it a while. You taught me that absence is a family language. I am finally fluent. Which I accept will be quoted against me for years at holidays and memorials and whatever thin gatherings we stage for the sake of DNA. But it was the truest sentence I have written about us, and my life is overdue for the truth. They did not call that day, and I suspect they drove home folding their anger into the old napkins they reuse, because appearances are a religion. And I imagine that Michael said something about overreaction while absently spinning the borrowed safe deposit key before my mother took it back with a quiet, practiced motion that has always meant she wants to control the damage. And I picture my father placing the envelope face down on his desk and staring at the wall where my diploma used to hang, before it was moved to make space for a canvas of Michael at bat, and I understand that each of them will convert this story into a version where I am the storm rather than the weather finally changing, because people rarely confess to building the conditions they later pretend to survive. As for me, I checked into a short-term rental by the water just far enough from our side of town to avoid casual collision, and I ate dinner alone at a counter where nobody knew my last name and therefore nobody could press me into being useful. And when the server asked if I wanted to set up a tab, I said no with a polite smile that felt like a small miracle, because it reminded me I am capable of ending things without apology. And later that night I stood on the balcony with the black phone in my hand, listening to the automated recording one more time to make sure my voice sounded calm rather than victorious, and then I powered it down and placed it in a drawer because those emergencies are not mine anymore. Maybe someday they will call for something real and I will pick up, not because a daughter must, but because a woman can choose the moment that honors her sanity, and maybe they will not. And the three of them will continue orbiting the center they mistook for the family, and I will continue building a life where I am not the free scaffolding holding up other people's comforts. Either way, the last thing I took is the only thing that matters, which is the permission to decide the terms of my presence, and that is one item they cannot reset, reclaim, or guilt back into their cloud.